Even while George Harrison smiled for the cameras, there was one guy behind the scenes who made his life a daily struggle. For years, this Beatles bandmate treated George like a servant, dictated what notes to play, and ridiculed his religious beliefs. George lost it and quit the studio in 1969. But it wasn't the worst of it. All the rules of friendship were broken by what this individual did when George was at his lowest. George repressed his anger against the betrayal till the very end. The startling truth about the Beatles member George Harrison detested the most will be revealed to you today. On February 25, 1943, he was born in a modest home at 12, Arnold Grove in Liverpool. The night he was born, the city had been attacked for 78 consecutive nights. His father, Harold, earned just £3 a week as a bus conductor. To save money on bus fares, he walked miles and worked 14-hour shifts. Up until the age of 16, George shared a bed with his brothers. His mother, Louise, only received a few shillings each building for cleaning them at night. For the entire week, they could only afford to buy food with 15 shillings. Nevertheless, Louise brought warmth and hope to their tiny home. George was 12 years old and riding his bike by a house in 1955. He stood motionless and listened to the entire song, Heartbreak Hotel, by Elvis Presley via an open window. At that moment, everything changed. The echo on the guitar was George's favorite aspect of Elvis Presley's songs. He hurried home and informed his mother that he was more in need of a guitar than food. All he did after that was sing. At the age of 14, George received his first guitar. To purchase an inexpensive Eggman flat top for £3.10, he walked all the way to Frank Hesse's music store. Despite the pain and weeks of bleeding fingers, he played 6 to 8 hours a day. After learning Rock Island Line, he quickly lost interest in school. With the exception of painting, he performed poorly in practically every class. In fact, George's teacher reported that he preferred music to math. In the same year, George got to know Paul McCartney. While traveling to Liverpool on the 86 bus, Paul saw George's guitar. To play 20 Flight Rock, as George said he could, he had to put in a lot of effort. It was cool, Paul thought. George soon tried out for the Quarrymen, Paul's band. Despite being just 14 years and 364 days old, he performed raunchy with great skill. That young person was not someone John Lennon wanted to invite. But George's brilliance was undeniable. He was the youngest member of the band and contributed to its rise to fame. George received assistance from his family in ways that most people wouldn't think possible. Louise took a third job cleaning the Cavern Club to help pay for his music. Harold could have lost his job if he hadn't allowed George to ride the bus for free. When George wanted a nicer piano, they gave theirs away. In order for the band to rent an amplifier for their first paid performance, Louise even gave away her wedding ring. Every cent assisted George's dream. One significant instance was when Paul McCartney was unable to play his solo during a performance because he stopped moving. The band was aware that they needed a more capable lead singer. Lennon wasn't sure, but Paul was certain that he wanted George. George was still a child. At last, Paul overcame him. Outside Wilson Hall, a second interview was arranged aboard a double-decker bus. George played raunchy once more before Lennon eventually accepted. George had joined by December 7th, 1957, which was far earlier than most people believed, according to additional research. From the beginning, George felt less like an equal to Lennon than a younger brother. The 3-year age gap was significant at the time. George believed that no one was listening to him, and people didn't always heed to his suggestions. As time went on, the tension increased. George blew up at the Let It Be meetings in 1969. After expressing his dissatisfaction to Lennon, he temporarily left the band. Indeed, Lennon discussed using Eric Clapton in his place. Ultimately, George claimed that he felt excluded, particularly after Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono. When George came, the Quarrymen were already in a bad spot. The majority of the founding members departed shortly after. Like Long John and the Silver Beatles, Japage 3, and Johnny and the Moondogs, their names constantly changing. They ultimately agreed to adopt the name the Beatles in 1960. Their music also changed when George joined them. They then transitioned to authentic rock and roll. He and Paul equipped their guitars with pickups and purchased an Elpico amplifier. The group's first electric edge came from this. George's understanding of how things operate influenced the early Beatles sound. Hamburg, which was a true survival test, came next. In 1960, they were scheduled at the Kaiser Keller. To pass the time, they performed for 8 hours every day, extending the duration of their songs. They were instructed to behave like untamed animals by the club's boss. George was just 17 years old. They shared a filthy room with other musicians and lived behind the stage. They slept very little. The club's guard was a former boxer who had killed someone on the street. Although it was difficult, they learned how to do it correctly. George performed in front of large crowds every night at the Star Club in 1962. In this way, he discovered what it takes to succeed as a musician. On February 9, 1964, something memorable happened on American television. 73 million people watched their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. That represents over 60% of all TVs in the nation on that particular evening. 50,000 individuals had requested tickets, but CBS only had 728 spots available. Just 7,000 people requested to listen to Elvis Presley's debut album in 1957. Ed Sullivan had his finest night in 7 years with a 45, 60 shares, and 3 stars. Richard Nixon's children, Julie and Tricia Nixon, were also present. As the Beatles sang, their names appeared on the screen for each of the 5 songs. I Want to Hold Your Hand, All My Loving Till There Was You, and She Loves You. The lettering said, "Sorry girls, he's married." When John Lennon entered the stage, it did more than just make people chuckle. It made everyone enamored with the Beatles and marked the beginning of what would be called the British invasion. In popular culture, it was significant. A few months prior to that significant event, George Harrison had begun writing songs. August 1963 was the month. He had to stay in bed at the Palace Court Hotel in Bournemouth because he was ill. A doctor prescribed medication and advised him to relax. Harrison had nothing to do and was bored, so he fiddled with a tape recorder. He then claimed that it was only to test his songwriting skills. In one recording, he is heard whistling the melody while working on the bridge because the words were not yet ready. That song became Don't Bother Me. According to a Liverpool reporter named Bill Harry, Harrison was pressured to write something. Don't Bother Me, he snapped back, and the song's title was born. Harrison claimed after many years that although the song wasn't very good and may not have been a song at all, it did convey a significant message. It proved to him that he could write, therefore he had to keep trying. The song was released on With the Beatles later that year. George's contribution to a Beatles record was his first, but then he ran into a wall. John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote nearly all of the songs on their albums. However, George was frequently limited to writing 2 songs every record. After 1965, this regulation remained in effect. As a result, tensions grew for years. According to Paul, there was an unspoken rule in 2022. From the beginning, he and John had decided that they would write the songs. We never said, let's keep George out of it. Paul clarified, however, George struggled to get his tunes recorded by the band. Lennon, McCartney, and their manager, George Martin, did not truly appreciate his work until the latter part of the Beatles' existence. In 1969, Paul finally remarked, now this year his songs are at least as good as ours. The media attention didn't help either. They gave each Beatle a name. The astute one was John Lennon. Paul was the most adorable. George remained silent. Ringo was fortunate. People saw them that way. From 1964 to 1970, the Beatles' single sold the most copies in America every 6 weeks, while their album sold the most every 3 weeks. They released an album with exclusively original songs in July 1964, making them the first pop group since Buddy Holly to do so. The title was A Hard Day's Night. However, much of the attention was focused on John and Paul. Every news report featured their names, and everyone talked about their romance. Although George's contribution to the band's sound was crucial, it was frequently overlooked. The pressure and limitations began to wear him down around 1965. In the same year, he took his first LSD trip and experienced Indian music for the first time. They met Swami Vishwananda in March, and he gave them a copy of the complete illustrated book of yoga. Later that summer, Harisson saw Elvis Presley, who introduced him to yoga. He wasn't really intrigued at first, but by the end of 1966, he focused more on the writings of Yogananda and Vivekananda. He wasn't just curious, he was searching for something more. While high on LSD in Greece in the summer of 1967, he and John spent hours reciting the Hare Krishna prayer. This resulted in the Beatles' well-known 1968 trip to Rishikesh. By August, the four of them had visited Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George's actions weren't solely motivated by his faith. When he felt like no one was paying attention to him in the band, they helped him de-stress and unwind. Making the film help. In April 1965, everything changed when he had a moment at Twickenham Studios. One scene had Indian music playing in the background. While everyone else waited in between takes, George entertained himself by playing the sitar. The sound was strange to him, but it stayed with him. At the same time, tracks influenced by Indian music were being released by bands like the Kinks and the Yardbirds. George, however, went farther. While the rest of the band was high on drugs, George's mind was elsewhere. No one else on the guitar was producing the same sound as him. He would use the sitar to sign his name. Harisson met Ravi Shankar at Ayana Deva Ungutti's home in June 1966, a year later. It was more than just a friends get-together. George and Ravi were able to travel together across India for 6 weeks in just 3 months. Typically, it took years for people to learn from Shankar. Almost immediately, however, he consented to educate George. George looked highly interested in Indian music and religion, Shankar added, and he was continuously asking questions. The sitar portion of Norwegian Wood initially didn't appeal to Ravi, but he knew George wasn't playing around. Their connection seemed to be faded. The sitar portion for Norwegian Wood was cut by George on October 12, 1965. It was the first time a Western pop song featured an Indian instrument. Oxford Street in London is where the sitar was purchased. It came from a music store in Kolkata. According to George, it didn't take long. He hit the correct notes. They simply followed the tune. The creation of rock music was altered by just one small incident. The short-lived raga rock style was influenced by this song, which was the first to incorporate the sitar in a pop song. That sitar brought $62,500 at auction after many years. The initial price was $50,000. While on vacation in Barbados, George gave it to his wife's friend, Patty Boyd. However, his passion for Indian music did not sit well with all of the band members. In 1968, they traveled to India to study under the Maharishi. Harisson wished he could relax and focus. Paul thought of something else. He continued to compose music for the White Album. It led to a big altercation. George said, "We're not here to do the next album," to Paul's later statement that George once got mad at me for trying to think of the next album and told me to shut up. Our purpose is to think. They were considerably different from one another after that time. Paul enjoyed working constantly. George waited for inspiration to strike. Paul believed that George's emphasis on his religion could be dangerous or even absurd. Paul didn't know what was important, George thought. George Harisson was often regarded as this solitary Beatle. Behind that serene image, however, was a storm that had been brewing for years. In 1966, George finally had his opportunity. For the Revolver album, he composed not one, but 3 songs. It was a huge thing. Taxman opened the entire album, followed by Love You Too and I Want to Tell You. Before that, he had hardly been able to add, but they shoved him back as soon as he took a step forward. As they began working on SGT, George performed only a Northern Song at Dr. Pepper's in the fall of that year. It made negative remarks about the band's handling of money and lyrics credits. In addition to rejecting it, Lennon and McCartney ensured that he only had 1 song on the album. George wasn't particularly intrigued, Paul later claimed. But that wasn't the case. George was unable to enter. Later, he described the entire album-making process as boring. In the end, he recorded Within You Without You alone. That day, he was the only Beatles member present in the studio. Indian players provided assistance, but not Ringo, Paul, or John. The rest didn't bother to appear, even after George Martin finished the song by adding strings. For the first time, Only one member of the band wrote a Beatles song. It was one of George's best tunes, according to Lennon shortly after, but he didn't care enough to go at the time. The situation worsened as a result of Paul's actions. George's interest in Indian music and faith was ridiculed by him. George was studying Hinduism by reading Vedic literature and playing the sitar. As George spoke, Paul would roll his eyes, laugh, and walk out of the room. George believed he was being ridiculed. They never even attempted to decipher what he was delivering, he claimed. That was quite painful. Music was no longer the only thing in the mind. They also found it amusing. The claim that the Beatles resembled a democracy was never accurate. Lennon and McCartney were in charge of everything. George received 1 or 2 tunes, and they assembled the remaining albums. Even when George had better tunes, they were never played. He didn't own his press. They did. He was paid less, received less, and heard less. At one point, Bob Dylan remarked, George had to fight to get anything on the records. It was accurate. He wasn't treated equally by them. He was treated like an employee. George wrote many songs in 1967 that no one else would listen to. All Things Must Pass was one of those. He presented it to Let It Be's meeting. It didn't work, McCartney and Lennon stated, laughing it off. It was a really tense meeting. To get the song away from them, George once handed it to Billy Preston. When he released it himself 3 years later, it became a classic. My Sweet Lord followed suit. These songs demonstrated that he was always correct, including Isn't It a Pity and Not Guilty, which they tried over 100 times before giving up. On January 10th, 1969, George left. Twickenham Studios was filming, and the band was rehearsing the song Get Back. Paul continued to criticize George's guitar playing, which was old news. It was George's for a week, but something broke that day. I went home and recorded one more song and ate some chips. He had reached his limit 4 days earlier, but this time it was on camera. He had been learning how to play again from Paul. He looked at George and said, I'll play whatever you want me to play. I won't play it all if you don't. That moment, captured on camera and never forgotten, showed how far he had been pushed. It wasn't mad. It was just ready to give up, which is why it was so strong. George quit that same night and went home to write Wah Wah. The title had 2 meanings. It hurt my head, but it sounded like a guitar. He described the band in this way. It was made for my own album. Proud, loud, and sharp. He chose to keep the best of his songs to himself. And when he returned home 5 days later, he gave them I Mean Mine instead. Things were not better at home. His wife, Patty Boyd, claimed that George would be upset and depressed when he got home from work, and the arguments never stopped. She said that it made him different, and that he didn't even like the way Paul was. He turned to religion to help him find peace, but the Beatles were destroying him. He only agreed to return after strict conditions were met, and because of him, they had to move the meetings from Twickenham to Apple Studios, and he canceled the live TV show. The most important thing was that he wanted more opportunities to share his songs, and they had to say they would. It made me feel bad. John joked that they would just hire Eric Clapton if George didn't return, and he returned despite the pain because he still cared, at least temporarily. One of the worst times was when they were recording Hey Jude, when George tried to play guitar riffs after Paul sang, and Paul told him to stop because it didn't look right. George didn't say anything, but Paul later said it was rude. Maxwell's Silver Hammer followed, and while Paul liked the song a lot, the others didn't, and it took 4 days to record. The first day alone had 16 takes. John didn't attend the meetings, and Ringo claimed it was the worst time he had ever spent singing. In late 1969, George ultimately won, and his song Something appeared on the same A-side as John Lennon's Come Together. For George, it was the first time he had ever been treated equally, but they did it anyway because Paul had instructed them to. Big deal, eh? It took too long, though. George had been writing songs like that for many years. They didn't pay attention. George released Run of the Mill on his solo record, All Things Must Pass. It was written for Paul. It became a hit in the U.S. John Lennon even called it the best song on Abbey Road, he told a reporter. The title was a pun, but it was obvious what it meant. George talked about how messy things were at Apple and how Paul kept saying that everyone else wasn't useful and that he was to blame for everything. The words were honest and even sad, but they didn't hold back. In 1974, George was ready to say it aloud when he said in an interview that Paul had made him doubt his playing skills, saying that he wasn't sure if he was good or bad anymore, and that someone else in Paul's band quit for the same reason. George wasn't just angry. He had been hurt. He had been told what to play, how to play it, and when to play it for years. At the same time, his marriage to Patty Boyd in 1966 seemed like a dream come true. They had met on the set of A Hard Day's Night, and it appeared that he had found his ideal woman, but behind the scenes, things were going wrong. By 1970, his best friend Eric Clapton was secretly in love with Patty, sending her frantic letters and even writing Layla to try to win her heart. Patty thought one of the letters was from a fan, so she showed it to George, but it was actually from a man George frequently had over to their house. The triangle didn't end for years, and the last time George and Patty got divorced was in 1977. She married Clapton after 2 years, but that marriage ended badly too. After many years, Clapton's letters were sold at auction for $3. $6 million. Then there was an even worse deception. George had an affair with Maureen Starr, who was married to Ringo Starr. The man didn't try to hide it. He told Ringo, "I love your wife," at a dinner party. Ringo tried to remain calm and said, "Better you than someone we don't know." However, when Patty discovered them together in a locked bedroom at George's house, and she yelled from outside, things really went south. George laughed, and when John Lennon later learned of it, he called it virtual incest. As a result, in 1975, both of the marriages ended. The fact that George was famous made it even more shocking. He spoke of wisdom, hope, and finding peace, but those who knew him said he was enraged, jealous, and horny. His second wife, Olivia, attempted to be tactful by claiming that George was only interested in women. George was a bag of beads and a bag of anger, Ringo said bluntly. He only hung out with supermodels. He was constantly lying, claiming that he was searching for spiritual truth, but he kept going on cocaine binges and having angry outbursts. George's use of drugs was much more than that. In 1965, a doctor secretly put LSD in his drink, which changed him forever. He smoked up to 4 packs of cigarettes a day, and he used cocaine constantly throughout the 1970s, but he advised Elton John to avoid the marching powder despite his own problems. He could dictate to others what they should do, but he was powerless to stop himself. Despite George's claims that he did not believe in greed, he surrounded himself with expensive items. His land, Friar Park, was more than just a house. It was a palace with 120 rooms and expansive gardens. He enjoyed fancy cars and only dated women who were referred to as goddesses by the media. His songs encouraged fans to let go of their pride. However, his life was not like that. Even when he traveled to India, he was not a humble seeker. It was like being a rock star and receiving special treatment. Living in the Material World, the title of his 1973 album, encapsulated the struggle. 2 lives had to be his choice.